Kia ora and welcome to Greenpeace Live. This is our regular Greenpeace show where we talk about the environmental issues of the day. And normally we stream it to you live, but in this case we had some technical difficulties. So while we did film this in-house with our guests live, we're only able to share it with you now. So I hope you really enjoy it. On this show, we've got Nicky Hager, who's an investigative journalist and was a core figure in the anti-nuclear campaign. We've got Stephanie Mills, who is the National Secretary for NZEI, worked for Greenpeace for many years and was a core part of the campaign to end nuclear testing in the Pacific. And author, storyteller and filmmaker Dan Salmon, who also used to work for Greenpeace back in the day and sailed on a yacht out to Muroroa to protest nuclear testing as well. So we talk about the anti-nuclear campaign and how it relates to the environmental challenges and campaigns that we're taking on today. Hope you enjoy.
This was the time of the later Cold War, later sort of American USSR nuclear confrontation, where the United States was moving new nuclear weapons up against the Soviet Union. It was the days when nuclear ships came into New Zealand, which had a variety of nuclear weapons on them, like Tomahawk cruise missiles with nuclear tips. They had special anti-submarine, like nuclear weapons that were fired over and dropped into the sea to destroy submarines. Other kinds of nuclear weapons that were fired up at aeroplanes. It was a crazy nuclear weapon-rich or infected time. And if you were living in that time, there was talk about a nuclear winter. If there was a nuclear war, that the world would, the sun would blot out. There'd be a nuclear winter and nothing to eat. And in fact, to people growing up in it, the best way to describe it is it felt very like it feels nowadays when people talk about climate. It's a similar intensity of risk and urgency to do something about it. And that's what I came into. I just moved to Wellington from my small provincial town. And I don't even remember why, but I was really interested to get hold of these people who were organising about the ships. Because the main way, when you've got an issue like the nuclear arms race, it would be possible to think we just have to say, stop the arms race. But actually, what people I was working with were aware of, and which I joined them in, was that we needed really, really concrete targets, or we could never get enough pressure to force change. And the concrete targets that we looked at were these great big American and British warships that would come in here with nuclear weapons on board, and nuclear reactors down in their holds, and submarines coming here with nuclear reactors and nuclear weapons. In other words, this really very concrete sign of the nuclear arms race coming into our harbours and pulling up at our wharves, and the sailors walking through the streets. And
why were they bringing them here?
They were bringing them not for operational reasons. They were bringing them here to solidify New Zealand in essentially a nuclear alliance. So it was a political act to keep us within the fold. And it was a fantastic campaign. I learnt so much in the years I did that, because everything was against us succeeding. At that time, there were people in Western Europe who were fighting desperately to try and stop nuclear weapons on their territories. The Japanese and the Australians tried to stop nuclear armed ships coming to their harbours. There's only one country that really succeeded, which was New Zealand. So it wasn't easy. It was really miraculous that we succeeded. And so I just want to run through roughly the kind of campaign it was, because it was the campaign and the luck of timing and other factors which meant that we were able to succeed. So what were the parts of it? One of the first and most important parts was the power of direct action. And having direct action against a clear, concrete epitome of what you're trying to stop. And so when the ships came into town, we'd built alliances with all different groups. And so in Wellington, where I live, when one of these nuclear ships came in, the whole of the harbour would close down because the unions had joined the campaign. So the unions would play this huge role of not allowing any work to go on, sometimes for days on end in the port while there was a nuclear ship there. The churches around the harbour had protest meetings in the churches. There were Women's for Peace groups. There were strong protests by Maori groups that joined us. There were strong connections between Maori groups that joined us, and the small Pacific islands that wanted to be nuclear free as well. And so there was this great wide movement building, which means that every time a ship came Basically, it was supposed to wear down our opposition, but actually increased the opposition of the public to what was going on. And so over a number of years, luckily they didn't send a ship every week or we would have been completely written off with exhaustion. But every 6 months or a year, one of these, a flotilla of these ships would come in, there would be this massive fight, and each time they came, the crowds were bigger and the marches were longer, and more groups had joined it. And then there comes a special part of the politics of this kind of change, which is that we were going through years of a national government that was buckling down and trying to beat us by having more and more American ships coming in here and things. And so the battle was getting harder and harder. But what was going on was that we were heading out of the years of a national government towards a Labour government. And because our protests were looking very popular and a lot of people seemed to be agreeing with them, the Labour Party said that when they were next in government, they would stop them. They would stop having nuclear-armed ships and nuclear-armed and powered ships in New Zealand. And so we came up to an election where it was a showdown over which way the policy was going to go. And because the Labour Party won the election and they had campaigned so strongly on becoming nuclear-free, it made it more likely. But it didn't make it likely enough to happen even then. And there was a huge bureaucratic battle where the last forces of the other side tried to stop it, which was the pro-American officials in Wellington, the defence officials and the foreign affairs officials, who tried to subvert the policy. But everyone knows what happened in the end. We won. That's a long campaign, but it's briefly put.
How long was the campaign?
It was 8 or 9 years. Mm. And of course, when you're 17 and 20, a year's a very long time. And one of the reasons I kept going, and many of us kept going, was because we were succeeding. We had a sense that we were doing something that was working, and it would get stronger every time. We had more ideas every time. We had more sections of society joining us, and so we were kind of impelled on to keep going.
Oh, it's really incredible. We're going to talk a little bit more about the movement and behind that in a minute. Stephanie, can you give us a bit of an overview of the...
Can I just say quickly?
Oh, yeah, please, go.
Stephanie was there in the midst of all of these things in Wellington, so that everything is connected,
Yes.
I mean, I got involved because I was really inspired by the women at Greenham Common, and I wasn't that interested in the technical aspects of nuclear weaponry, as Nicky knows. I was interested in what kind of future I had as a 17-year-old too, and it seemed to me that that the world might end, and that seemed very unfair. I think the other aspect, if you're taking a sort of even longer historical lens, is that New Zealand had experienced the atmospheric tests of the French and the British and the Americans in the Pacific in the 50s and 60s. Strontium had been found in the teeth of New Zealand children and so on. And so there was a latent, well, probably not even that latent, but quite strongly latent at least, sense of anti-nuclearism from that perspective. And so I ended up travelling, working for the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament in the UK, meeting people who then worked for Greenpeace and got involved in Greenpeace. But I think in terms of that role of Greenpeace in those years, through the 70s, 80s and 90s, Elaine Shaw, I just wanted to talk Elaine. She was pivotal to the establishment of the New Zealand office and to the nuclear campaign here. And she was always staunch about the fact that we worked with people in Tāmaki, in Tahiti, Polynesia, and in the Pacific. And so the first journeys, I guess, to Muroroa in the early 1970s, the Vega, the Free, David McTaggart, Anna Horn, various people that probably even people in the audience will recognise. Those were precursors of, I guess, a larger, stronger Greenpeace commitment over those years leading into the 80s and 90s. So people sometimes forget or didn't know that, before the Rainbow Warrior came to New Zealand in 1985, it had been to the Marshall Islands, where we were working with the Marshallese to try and get justice for the nuclearisation and contamination of their land in Whenua. And it was then the French decision to try and stop Greenpeace going to Muroroa at any cost, which resulted in the bombing of the Rainbow Warrior in July in 1985 and the death of Fernando. So I think what then transpired was, I think it fed into the strongly kind of anti-sentiment and anti-nuclear sentiment here in New Zealand, and the support for an independent foreign policy, because the people that said they were our friends were not. The UK and the US essentially sided with France, and so I think in that sense that's at the point at which the support for not just the nuclear-free legislation but for a more independent New Zealand position globally kind of coalesced together. I was a journalist working on the Herald in 1985, so I wasn't working for Greenpeace. I covered the Rainbow Warrior bombing as part of a large suite of Herald journalists doing bits and pieces, and then ended up, as I say, in the UK working for the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, and then came back here in 1990 when we basically resuscitated the campaign against nuclear testing.
Man, it's so fascinating. How old were you when you came back to do that?
I guess I was 27, 28.
Similar to Nicky, I guess, in that a long time period from being 17 or still working
later,
on
yeah.
solution. Wow. Dan, you have quite a different story. So you sailed out to Muroroa as part of a big grassroots flotilla. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. No. I sailed up in '95. The sort of background for me was I grew up with my dad sailing out, trying to stop the ships coming in with weapons back in the 80s, and so came from a home that had stood up against it. And so in '95 I was a media student, and you may correct me here, Steph, but my memory is that David McTaggart went on 60 Minutes or 2020 or something and called for New Zealanders to get on their boats and head up to Muroroa to support the protests up there. And I was a sailor. I've had ocean navigation experience and had to make a student film, and it sort of just was logical to me that I try to get on one of the boats and go up. And an organisation, I don't know whether they were formal or not, called the New Zealand Peace Flotilla, came together with different people coordinating it, and coordinated boats looking for crew and crew looking for boats. So I wound up on a steel boat that had been built on the west coast of the South Island with 3 guys from Kumara, one gold miner, one ex-policeman, and the other a fisherman. So it was very much a New Zealand grassroots boat. And I think there were a dozen to 20 boats that came from here, and a bunch came from Australia too, largely motivated by that call for us to get off our asses and sail up.
Were those 3 people on your boat? They sailed up there?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. And there was another student who came with me too, Martin Taylor. Yeah.
I want to talk about that a little bit more. I mean, Nicky, you were talking about this kind of broad sweeps of society getting in behind this campaign, and I mean, Dan, that's fairly obvious in terms of a pretty diverse range of people on one little boat sailing out. What do you think it was, or how did you get such broad support over such a long period in behind this? This is a question for all of you, whoever wants to
I think it was the work these guys had done and built this sort of popular sense of who we were and what we stood for.
Can I give a loftier view of it?
Yeah.
I think that one of the undiscussed parts of New Zealand is that for 100 years there's been a strong and growing movement against militarism, and that didn't come from Christian peaceniks or something in the early days. It came from people coming back from the First World War, totally appalled by what they'd had to go through.
I felt a group of us who were in, between 17 and 25, and then there was this big gap, and there was that generation of kind of our grandparents or our great-grandparents maybe even, who came from that older tradition. And somewhere in the middle were these, I don't know, we probably would have called them the boomers or something, who didn't seem to care. And so, but I remember when I was involved in Women for Peace, and I used to hang out with a couple of women who lived in Newlands who went to play centre and had kids, and were like really just, what I would, in my 17-year-old arrogance, thought of as kind of New Zealand housewives. And they were just so staunch, and yet they were very, very ordinary as well. And yeah, so I think it was it is one of those things where you get a whole lot of things synthesizing at once. And I also think you shouldn't underestimate, the brilliance of strategists like Nicky. I mean, it is about individuals as well as collective contributions, and sometimes you just get the right people in the right time at the right place.
But I mean, it's not like people were joining this kind of pleasant thing. I mean, you talk about jumping on yachts and going out to sail, but you're going to sail into nuclear testing zones, and you talk about people sinking your boats when you're out there, and police being really violent, and you've got the French boarding the vessels and then ultimately bombing the Rainbow Warrior. And I mean, people are standing up against something pretty scary from even the state here. What do you think gave people that bravery?
I think it was it's always the optimism of the action over the pessimism of the thought. I'd rather throw myself into something than worry about what might happen. So that, I mean, for me personally, I think I was always more worried about probably other people's safety. I remember standing on the bridge watching a young woman getting into the last inflatable heading off to Muroroa and thinking, oh my God, what will her mother think if something happens, and feeling terribly responsible. Yeah.
My worst moment up there was handing a baby from an inflatable, because the mother was too scared to pass it up, to a naval officer in 4-metre swell, and I was sort of too young and stupid to realise quite possible consequences. I remember holding this baby and this guy looking in the eyes and going, this time, and thrusting it, because there was a boat up there that had the family on board. And so in terms of you're worrying about other people, I think for me, I went because I could, and you're up there just sort of trying to make sense of it all, really. What can you do? You do something.
I put it a bit differently. I think for people living in New Zealand and being politically active in New Zealand, we're in one of the safest, least dangerous, easiest places in the world. And so we should push it as hard as we possibly can when we try and do something good. And so a big part of what happened with the nuclear armed powered ships coming into our harbours was that rather than us saying, peace now or something, we were saying, you cannot allow any ship to come into our harbours unless we are satisfied, and the government is satisfied, that it does not have nuclear arms or nuclear reactors on it. And so what we were trying to do is we were trying to take away the wriggle room where politicians could say, yeah, we're all for peace too, we're all for nuclear free too, but not do anything, which of course is the most common thing you see in political debates. And as the day of a real decision got closer, the efforts to blur it and to make more wriggle room for the government to not do anything and not to actually change the policies in a real way increased. And that was where strategy was needed, because if we hadn't noticed what they were doing, and if we had let them make generalized, non-specific, empty undertakings for how they were going to respond to this nationwide movement, we would have nothing today. The nuclear-free policy would be a vague memory. And it was being very specific. I remember a few months before the final decision was made, and we published a list of every ship in the US Navy and every ship in the British Navy which could not come to New Zealand under the policy. So we were saying, this is not vague, this is really black and white. If you're a new Labour government who says you're going to make us nuclear free, if you invite any of these ships here, your words were empty and there's no nuclear free policy. And if you invite ones which aren't on that list, well, cool, we might not like them, but that's not what the policy is about. And so the idea of it was we were doing what everyone in politics should do, which is not leaving wriggle room for words which end up equating to nothing, to empty promises.
Making sure there's a binary decision.
A binary decision, yes. And so when you've been in this kind of situation, this is a long time ago we're talking about, but when I see people now involved in politics, I think, be clear what you're asking for, be careful what you're asking for. Don't hand to lazy or incapable politicians an easy way out that you don't even know you're giving them.
I mean, it's a useful lesson, and I'd be keen to hear others' thoughts on that too, because I think when you're looking back at history, at successful campaigns, they kind of are inherently whitewashed, or you see the kind of glamour bits of it. And you, as you said at the beginning, it's quite easy to think, oh, that's cute, that we're nuclear free. And it's easy to think maybe there wasn't a big fight where you had to be that binary, and maybe people were just saying, nuclear free, friendly and happy. And it's really useful to know like what those things were.
Yeah, well, I'd also, do you want to say something, Stephanie?
Well, I was just reflecting that, this conversation just reminds me a bit traumatically of some of the huge arguments, the huge debates about strategy, which, I think, when you're in the middle of them, you think there must be a better way, but actually probably it is the way to get through to clarity, I suppose. But certainly when I came into Greenpeace in 1990, there was a huge argument about whether we should even be revisiting the nuclear testing campaign. And most of the nuclear campaign was focused on the nuclear free seas work. It was 100% male campaigners. They were doing some really amazing research and worked with, people like Owen and Nicky. And the nuclear testing thing was seen as the women's campaign. And sort of annoying, and also not very, a bit problematic, because there was that sort of environmental stuff as well as the military stuff. You had this kind of unresolved debate about whether we supported independence in the Pacific, because the Greenpeace France office was very concerned about the impact that would have on its reputation in France. And there was also a concern that a nuclear test ban was really only a kind of symbolic thing, because all the testing would end up in the laboratories. And so there was this huge debate about whether we even returned to Tahiti and to Muroroa. And so, every campaign has its own struggles within its own movement. And I think that there was also, like France, relatively speaking, had a nuclear testing campaign that was insignificant militarily compared with the US nuclear testing program, for example. And so I think Nicky's right about the value of really concrete objectives and concrete objects, if you like, to go up against. But sometimes things also have a symbolic value that goes beyond their kind of technical and concrete value. And I guess that's why Muroroa was the lever we chose to try and get the issue of the test ban raised, globally, because Mitterrand originally, wanted to. He was a socialist originally, and he wanted to leave a historic legacy of disarmament, because things were warming up between Russia and the USSR, Gorbachev and Reagan at that point, because we knew that we were heading into an issue of proliferation by other countries. If nuclear testing wasn't stopped, that would be harder to stop once other countries like India and Pakistan kept resuming testing and so on. So there was some reasons, I think, that the decision to go ahead with testing was a difficult, but was ultimately a very strategic one for Greenpeace.
Can I butt in?
Yeah.
But Steph, in fact, you're also confirming what we were saying, which is that the French nuclear testing in the Pacific, or no French nuclear testing in the Pacific, was a really fantastic example of a clear line. You've won or you haven't won. The governments have done what the people asked them for, or they haven't done. It was really clear compared to lots of other issues, which were a bit of this and a bit of that. But not. I think the greatest value of that one was its clarity compared to other things.
Yeah, and I think it had the other thing it had, which I think the nuclear movement had here too, was that people could come into it because they were concerned about militarization, or because they were concerned about the environmental impacts, because they were conservationists or had concern about the oceans, or because they were strongly supportive of Indigenous people having independence in the Pacific, or because they didn't think, maybe they didn't really care that much about nuclear testing, but they really didn't think France should be doing it over here. They should do it in their own backyard. So there were kind of multiple entry points for people to have an opinion that supported the campaign without it having to be kind of ideologically, you have to think this way to think that way, if that makes sense.
So, but how did you get there? So I think one of the things that's hard in campaigning is taking yourself from caring about an issue to turning it into a campaign with those concrete asks. And I think climate change is maybe a good example. So how did you, I think what you're referring to, Nicky, in the vagueness is the banner that says climate action now, which means that the government can do one small thing and say they've done climate action. But your comparison of the fight against nuclear and that kind of existential threat, where it's so big, it's everywhere, in the same way that climate change is now. How did you get down to saying, okay, it's the warships coming here and it's the testing in the Pacific? Like, it seems maybe easy looking back at it, but was that hard decisions of where to focus energy, or was it pretty straightforward to choose those things?
Things become, like my kids can't imagine nuclear warships coming into New Zealand, or, France letting off bombs in the Pacific. I mean, it seems incredible to them that it ever happened. And it's ancient history that it happened, which is great, right? It doesn't.
Because I think the other thing too is both these things are really highly visual. And for people sitting at home, talking to people about the Muroroa protests from Germany and France, and they were going, well, what can we do? We can't really do anything. And they see these little boats bobbing up and down next to big French military ships, galvanise people to do things in their own towns and Germany and so on. And the same with the ships out in the harbours here stopping the other thing. People go, well, if they're doing that big thing, I can do this little thing. And so having these visuals that really inspire people, I think, is really important. And that's where we've seen with climate change, there are occasional images that capture the imagination and then they kind of get lost. But there's not an image of that's captured that battle, I don't think, yet, of people, the people power thing to galvanise people.
Yeah, and images of people asking other people to go and sign a document in a room full of more politicians. It doesn't make for very compelling viewing, does it?
So the best thing is a combination of both, and research and all the rest of it, yes.
There's also the question of who benefits, right? And we all currently benefit in many ways from the way we use energy right now. And so asking people to make a difference around climate requires an immediate kind of thinking about your own personal behaviour. And I don't think, one of the reasons I personally think that people really like Greenpeace in the past, because of the whaling campaign and the French nuclear testing campaign, was precisely because it was a bit offshore. People could feel morally superior here, but they didn't actually have to change their lifestyle. So I think that's the downside, right? That's the side that you go, well, what next? I was always a passionate believer that the whaling campaign should have moved on to a Southern Ocean sanctuary that was much broader than Wales, much more promptly and with much more visibility. Because I think we lost some real momentum there, because we kept going on and going back to the IWC and worrying about whether it was X number of minke whales or Y number of minke whales, when actually the big issues that were impacting on the whale populations were climate change and were overfishing. So I think sometimes I would say that we've missed opportunities as well to build on those successes. And there's probably things that, as a nuclear campaign, we didn't build on sufficiently as a result of that win around nuclear testing too. I think we did have a strong focus on the plutonium trade, and I think that worked to a large degree because, again, it was about global shipments of nuclear material. And so that was kind of a follow-up in terms of its impact on the Pacific and the risks of proliferation and militarization of both, Japan, but potentially other countries involved in plutonium production and reprocessing. But we certainly haven't stopped everything nuclear just because we're feeling nice and safe and nuclear free here.
Stephanie, I want to slightly challenge something you said, but also ask a kind of broad question around it, which is around people's kind of personal blame in the issue and having to, reckon with that in climate change. But I guess one of the things we've battled for decades in the climate movement and in other issues too is an industry that has kind of successfully made everyone else feel like it's their fault when the biggest polluting industries, they say, well, it's you because you drove your car and you did this and you did that. Well, actually, they're causing this disproportionately, outrageously large amount of pollution. And I was wondering, were there versions of that in the nuclear campaign too? Was it like, well, we're doing this to keep you safe? And so this, I don't know, was there a version of that you had to reckon with at the time?
It was the deterrence argument, wasn't it? It's really easy when you've got bad guys, right? And for the average person, someone pressing a button to set off a bomb that causes centuries of pollution to an atoll in the Pacific is a really easy thing to step up against. But with climate change where it is, so where that suggestion of all of our complicity is an easy thing to be thrown around, it's harder to go, well, hang on, who are the really immoral people that we can step up against? And finding those targets and finding fair targets is the battle, I think, really. I'm sorry to use a war metaphor.
How did you know what you were doing when you first joined the campaign?
Oh, I can reliably say that when I left Levin at 17 years of age, I had no idea about anything about politics. But within a year, I was quite involved in it. And one of the things I would say, it might sound a bit random, but I'm really glad I joined a group of mixed age. And I'm glad I didn't join a group of other 17 and 18-year-olds, because we would have all not known what to do. But I had pictures of people like the man in the manual job down on the wharves who would say, I just sat down during my lunch hour and drafted a leaflet. And I thought, wow, you can live your life like this. And then another group, I was involved in conservation campaigns as well. And there was one of the people there, I once saw him open one of his folders, and there were these dozens and dozens of letters he'd written for information. And so to my very young brain, I was thinking, oh, so you can write to get information from the government, can you? And so I was having all these experiences of seeing people showing that there was stuff that they could do. People much older than me, but by seeing them, it made those different futures seem possible and tantalizing, in fact.
And Stephanie, you mentioned Elaine Shaw and others you were inspired by. How did you kind of get a sense of what to do and where you should be?
Well, I think my family has always had active political discussion. My mother's mother was a Quaker and a sort of fellow traveller, and was passionate about global peace in a probably slightly more diffuse way than I was. And I think when you're 17 and you're marching the streets with tens of thousands of people regularly, because it was regular between the Springbok tour and the anti-nuclear marches, it was a lot. You do get a really tangible sense of collectivism. So I think that has never lost me, that actually you can do so much more with more people than you can do on your own. I think also the importance of centering your values and as Dan described, making them visible in some concrete way, but encapsulating them, making sure your values transfer in that image or that action. Not just hanging a banner that says words, but actually making sure that the action articulates and is the right vehicle for the message that you're trying to project. I had a very good first boss at Greenpeace who probably drove all of us a bit mad, but she was a very good strategist and planner. And I think you can be the best strategist in the world, but if you can't drive the implementation of plans with other people, you end up sitting in a room on your own. I think the other thing is the importance of, I mentioned before, the importance of optimism. I think in the end, people can come to movements out of fear, but they have to stay with it because they've got a sense of hope. And fear ultimately turns people, a lot of normal, ordinary people off. And so the importance of your campaign strategy and narrative having, not just a binary yes or no, but a sense of hope and optimism that it represents a better world, for want of a longer way of saying it.
And is the hope maintained by a sense of making progress?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think Nicky's point about concrete objectives, I don't believe that you should only campaign on things that everybody thinks is winnable. That doesn't seem to me to be a campaign at all. But I do think that you need to set some objectives that the people you work with agree on are kind of, short, medium, and long term. I mean, there has to be some way that you move things, and then also celebrate the wins that come from their field, because they're the result of those kind of zeitgeist moments that what you're doing partly contributes to, but may surprise everybody.
Was it a surprise when? Did it feel like a surprise when New Zealand became nuclear free?
Oh, deeply. It was so big. It was so controversial, and we had the United States, the most powerful country on earth, furious at us and threatening destabilization and cutting trade, and it was really big. And so I actually think you get your satisfaction in politics from speaking well in the news, having a good press release, finding good information, working well as a team. That's plenty of satisfaction. Did I think we would win? Not for a long time. No, never occurred to me really.
I mean, it just sort of showed to me that you can do stuff, and you can, if you get out there and do something, you can change things. And that's a really inspiring, positive way to be, I think. And in terms of, Steph talking about needing some optimism and needing that, I think we look back at those moments and we can be fed by them.
And
I was thinking of that moment I stood up in the Beyond Answers conference, Nicky, which was kind of classic. So there was this conference of very, very amazing people basically telling us how the Third World War was going to start, is how I felt. And I stood up and I can't even really remember what I said. Nicky might remember because we had a bit of a row afterwards. But essentially I said, we've got to move from this technical stuff to actually thinking about people. It seemed not very people-centered to me. And I suppose that's one of the reasons that I got involved in the nuclear issue, was not because I knew anything or was even that interested in the sort of big picture global militarization. I mean, I learned along the way a lot, but because when I thought about what was happening to people in Tahiti, Polynesia, to women who'd given birth to jellyfish babies and all the rest of it, and to the actual impacts on people there and the environment, it was just like, how can we be silent on this issue that affects our nearest neighbours? So I still feel that responsibility. I think that's one of the other complexities of campaigning with other groups, is how you move beyond effectively quite transactional relationships into sort of genuinely collaborative ones, and what responsibility do you have to continue those relationships after an initial campaign objective might be one.
Mm-hmm. Dare we ask the nature of the conflict about all of this, or is that something better left back in the day?
Probably Steph and I should talk about it.
Oh yeah, we'll let you do that offline and bring it back next time.
I think it's all dead and gone and past history. But you know, all I'm saying is that I think, for most people to come and stay in a movement, they need to have some fun, they need to have some joy, they need to have some creativity, as well as the hard yards. You know, because it is about building a community that people want to stay in and keep contributing to. Because as you said at the beginning, these campaigns are usually for the long haul.
I mean, Dan, I get a bit of a sense that looking back on that feels like a time of joy of going out to do something pretty serious, but jumping on a boat, being inspired by the work and wins that came before you.
Time leaves you with the more positive memories than the 3 weeks of seasickness and 12-metre waves and things. But, I think that there is a joy in people working together to try and achieve something, whether you're building a shed with friends or whether you're sailing off into the Pacific to try and stop a nuclear bomb. That sort of sense of common purpose is a joyful thing. That's why we kind of exist, and that's what we need to, I think, move back towards now from social media-based campaigning. We kind of need people coming together and connecting.
In real life?
In real life, yeah.
Can we talk quickly about key lessons that you would want to share with people who are campaigning on social justice or environmental issues now that you learned along the way? What are your kind of key top-line messages? That's a big question because there's so much in the whole thing. It doesn't have to be your best one. Should we start with you, Stephanie?
Oh God, I mean, you're always learning. It's not, in every context is a bit different.
From this campaign, what do you think?
From the French nuclear testing campaign. Well, one thing is that if you're working on a global issue, you have to have a global strategy, I think. Not necessarily, dictated by some central Stalinist command, but you need to have an approach that is beyond national boundaries. We couldn't have won the French nuclear testing campaign just from New Zealand. We had to shift politics in France. We had to make judgments about what was happening in terms of the politics of the US and USSR at that time, and we had to think about what was likely to happen down the road with India and Pakistan and Israel and so on. So I think if your strategy has to be as big as your ambition, I suppose. And it's that I think it's that, like I said before, I think what you do has to be done in the way that expresses why you're doing it. And I don't know if that's a female thing or not, but there were some robust debates in Greenpeace at the time about what and how we did at Muroroa, and one of them was about what happened actually in terms of going into the test site, how far people went. And so I think we always had to be really clear that we were the good guys, and we behaved in ways that good guys behave. We don't use tools or use tactics that actually the bad guys use. And sometimes it's really tempting because you want to use those tools and tactics, but I think ultimately you've got to be authentic to the values that you're espousing and the tactics that you use.
Then there's heaps to learn, because there are heaps to learn. And when I say there are lots of tools in the toolbox, I mean that, yes, there's all the stuff to do with research and information and ideas. There's all the stuff to do with messaging, of how you talk to people, not according to what you think, but according to where they are, so that they hear what you've got to say. And all the different ways of energizing an issue, like we've been talking about, the non-violent direct action, which is such a good one. But there are numerous other ones. And there are ways to include people, and there's ways to build, not just in the cities, as we've talked about, but to have people in every small town who are thinking it's their issue as well, and so on. It goes on. And the people don't know this, and of course they don't know it. They're just like we were when we were 17 or whatever. Watch other campaigns, learn from other people, read about past issues and steal all their good ideas, because all that stuff is waiting to be used again over and over.
It was some universal truths of change making.
There are some
close to universal.
Yes.
You can read about it. Beautiful. We are going to shift to some questions from our audience, if I can make that happen. Oh, 1 second.
I think the other fundamental thing is that, making change should be democratizing as well. And I think that, one of the things that we've done in our union has been, I was just reflecting on this today, has been to try and collectivise women working in early childhood education who have, where there's been no union tradition at all. And the first thing is not to ask them to join the union. The first thing is to help them find their own voice. And so I think that's right, Nicky. It is finding your own voice and finding your tribe. And then you can move mountains.
Okay, we have one question here that's for you, Nicky, that says that you've been quoted as saying, lots of information isn't secret, it's just hard to find. Is that your trick as a journalist? And Stephanie's been a journalist too.
So what I've been talking about is what I learned and what I still believe in from my, within my 20s and things. But so that quote comes from my subsequent career, which is investigative journalism. And the reason what I was saying with that, I realized at some point that basically that if I tried hard enough, if a person tried hard enough, things which seemed like they were secret, there was always some way to do it. And so what that was trying to break down is the idea of you've got secrecy and we're on one side and the information's on the other, and you can't get it unless someone official gives it to you. Whereas in my work, if I think I'm sure there's an answer here, or I'm sure there's documents that will reveal the truth of this issue, if I put enough hours into it, I've nearly always found a way to do it. So it's a saying about the power of persistence and technique and determination in getting into information.
Great. And putting pieces together, because that's what you excel at, is that kind of networking of information from different sources. One piece giving you the clue to another.
Thank you.
That's, I think, certainly having done journalism, that was a useful background for me. I think it's, that curiosity about trying to find out stuff and not having a fear about trying to find out.
We've got a question here about the Rainbow Warrior. Should be able to say this by now in Greenpeace. The Rainbow Warrior bombing in 1985. So it was a shocking event for the country. What are your memories of that time, and why would the French go to such extremes at that time?
Steph.
Well, I was actually, when I was working at the Herald, I was working sort of part-time for them as a music reviewer, as well as being a journalist full-time. And I'd been to a concert and had written a review and was driving home, and all these fire engines came tearing down College Hill at me, and I was thinking, oh, I wonder what's going on, and thought, I'm glad I'm not monitoring the police radio tonight. And went to bed, and at 6 o'clock a friend rang crying and said the French have bombed the Rainbow Warrior. I mean, she didn't know it was French. So yeah, that's what I remember as the day it happened. Yeah.
Anything you want to share?
No, I just remember the shock. Yeah, I mean, I was only 15, but everyone was kind of stunned.
Yeah, we were all shocked. That didn't happen in New Zealand. But we were shocked for another reason later when we thought about it harder, which was that actually that didn't happen in New Zealand, but it happens in lots of other places. Mm-hmm. And we're used to being a place where that wouldn't happen. And what had happened this time was that it wasn't the Russians or something. It was a European country which was then defended by the United States and Britain, who were showing their disapproval of New Zealand for acting independently earlier that year over the nuclear-free policy. So this is one of the strange, great, less told parts, or not so told parts of the Rainbow Warrior bombing, and that is that although the nuclear-free policy had come in a few months earlier, there was still quite a lot of people who didn't agree with it. But by the time they'd seen the French bombing and then the Americans and the British not being prepared to stick up for us in it, that had played a huge role in cementing in the nuclear-free policy. Actually, it was a terrible thing, but it had this immense, unexpected consequence, which was that it swung even more people behind the nuclear-free policy.
I think Longy being funny didn't hurt too. When we look at the homosexual law reform bill again, we had some really angry people on one side and some happy dancing people on the other side, and the undecided people went with the happy people. They went with the funny person with Longy, and humour's a thing that we often don't talk about, which is really hard to bring into something like climate change and other campaigns.
Nuclear war, yeah. We've got a question about your thoughts, not for any specific one of you, but your thoughts on the fact that in the UK, 5 young people just got 5 years in jail for attending a Zoom call organising climate action. Do you have any thoughts around, I guess to try and wrap it up, around why governments or people in power take action against activists like that? Is it a sign of effectiveness of the campaign, or do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, probably. I think they do come after you when you're winning. They also come after you when you do the same thing twice or 3 times. We've experienced that in Greenpeace. If we don't learn from, doing one thing and doing it differently the next time. But fundamentally, it's about, the power of the state resisting change and using the tools they have in a way that is completely unacceptable in that instance. I kind of joke about the number of times I've been deported and things like that, but I think for most activists, you go into it knowing there can be consequences, but you generally think that the consequences are going to be proportionate and that you're acting in the public interest, and that you're going to get a fair hearing. And I don't think that's what's happened in the UK.
I can add a wee bit more to that from my journalistic work, which is that in many things, in a variety of things that I've worked on, the problem hasn't been that the governments have become more aggressive or intolerant. It's that there have been powerful businesses that have been asking them to do something about the protesters, and it's that corporate influence seems to me to be, on at least many issues, the main factor in this intolerance and crackdown that you see.
We have one more question here about, it's just moved. A lot of people at the moment are doing submissions and signing petitions in response to the environmental rollbacks of this government. Is that useful? So maybe this comes into your toolbox question. Your answer.
Who wants to start?
Everything's useful.
Yeah, pretty much anything is better than nothing. I mean, I think the test is going to come when we see that list of the fast track projects, and the test is going to come when we see the impact it's going to have on the environment and on communities, on mana whenua. And then we're going to have to do more than sign petitions. We're going to have to stand up and get our big girl pants on and go back and do direct action, or go back and join hands with communities and do more stuff. Because actually it's easy to stand up for your values when there isn't a consequence, but actually I think what the 80s taught us was that we were in initially very what felt like hostile times, but that actually when people come together and do things, it does change the course of events. And it, you have to believe in the long arc of justice and the fact that there are setbacks, but sometimes those setbacks are the platform from which you build and pivot to better things.
And I guess as Nicky pointed out earlier, in Aotearoa, we've got more civic space than almost anywhere else to be activists. And so we should be stepping up into our ability to be as kind of brave and bold as we can be, while we can be, where we can be.
But I think two numbers count. So the more people that sign things and the more people that submit, the more that voice is listened to on a political level. So keep signing.
I was going to say the same thing. I think, as a general rule, submissions are the thing I would probably least be interested in myself. But on the, for example, the fast track bill, the number of submissions that came in will have caused the government to pause and wonder about what it's doing. So it's a tool which, used well, has an effect. But the main thing I would say, as well I've said already, is that political change in all the cases I know of comes from a wide mixture of tools used strategically.
Is there anything you would like to ask of the audience? Any next steps you'd like the audience to take? It's okay if there's not.
I'll say something general, just for the sake of it. If there are people there thinking, I couldn't do all that, I don't know about that, well, we didn't either. Don't expect to know everything at once. Don't expect that somebody can just walk into a complicated issue and have an influence straight away. But I'd say, find the people who you like being with, find people who seem to be being effective, join them, stay with them if they seem to be good, discover your power. And if you're lucky enough to discover your power, that you can actually make a difference, that's when you end up doing it for the rest of your life.
Beautiful.
I think kind of the thing that stops us is a feeling of hopelessness. And things can feel absolutely overwhelming in a number of the areas that we've talked about. But, if we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, that's going to completely change the way things, the playing field, really. And so if you look at Biden stepping down the other day, the whole world of American political activists changed overnight, and something that was looking like an impossibility suddenly became an exciting, joyful possibility for those people. And I think that can happen. That'll happen with climate change, I'm sure.
Stephanie?
What would be my question? Well, my question would be, choose something that you really care about, and commit to doing something tomorrow and the next month and the month after that. And it only has to be a small thing, but as Nicky said, find some people that you like doing it with. And in many ways, it's no more difficult than navigating a relationship or a discussion at work. It's about stepping out beyond your own comfort zone. But you can do it in a small way, and that's as legitimate as being on a boat in the middle of the ocean.
Awesome. One of the things Greenpeace would like to ask people to do after this conversation is to sign on to the open letter to the oil industry that we currently have live, which is basically saying, we won the offshore oil and gas ban some years ago. This government is threatening to overturn that. At this stage, we think it's unlikely that there's going to be oil ships coming off the coast here to try and drill, because the cultural shift against that was so strong that the government can change the law, but we don't think that the oil industry is going to try and come here and pick the fight with the New Zealand people again. But this open letter is a pledge to say, if the oil industry comes and tries to search for oil off the coasts here, we will stand up and fight them again, so they should stay away. So please jump on and sign that. Subscribe to the Greenpeace Live YouTube show, and we'll have a link to that in the comments. And I really want to thank the three of you, not just for coming and being on the show with us, but for your lifetimes of dedication to campaigning and to making the world a better place, and for your bravery and your willingness to maybe naively step up into what you did in this campaign. It's fascinating to hear about, and I think we could do many more versions of this show and different parts of the story. So thank you all so much for that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll be back again next week in 2 weeks, on the next Greenpeace live show in 2 weeks to talk about fresh water. So we will see you then. Thank you for joining us.